Now it's time for tonight's feature speaker, whose book Feather Trails, which I have right here, that I read and loved. And you can please see the link in the chat on how to purchase it. Now here's Hillary Penner, who is the education coordinator for Reef Environmental Education Foundation, to introduce our tonight's speaker, Sophie Osborn.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. We're so excited and so pleased to have Sophie joining us tonight. We're really lucky to spend the next couple minutes learning about her adventures and her discovery in saving endangered birds. She has been did her schooling in Pennsylvania and did her Master's of Science in organismal biology and ecology from the University of Montana, where she currently resides, and started her research focus on American dippers. Such a treat. She is a wildlife biologist, a conservation, and an author. She has worked with over a dozen bird species in the US and Central and South America, and contributed to their reintroduction efforts for several birds, and also worked with the California Condor Recovery Program as the field manager in Arizona for 4 years. And if you loved reading, or if you haven't got a chance yet to read Feather Tales, you will love it. And then you can also pick up her book that she wrote in 2007 called Condors in Canyon County, which won the 2007 National Outdoor Book Award for Nature and the Environment. So thank you so much, Sophie. We're really pleased and thankful to have you here. And I'm going to turn it over to you to do your presentation, and then we'll have some question and answer time afterwards.
That sounds terrific. I'm going to share my screen. And where is my talk? Okay, can everyone see that, hopefully? All right, good evening, and a big thanks to all of you for tuning in tonight to hear about conserving endangered birds. I know that Hurricane Milton and the election have taken a toll, so I really appreciate that some of you have rallied to be here tonight. My new book, Feather Trails, A Journey of Discovery Among Endangered Birds, describes my journey into the amazing world of birds. The book is in part a personal story about becoming and being a wildlife biologist. It takes you behind the scenes, and it shows you what it's like to reintroduce captive raised birds to the wild in order to save 3 endangered species: Peregrine Falcon, Hawaiian Crow, and California Condor. And in the process, the book illuminates the threats that imperiled these birds and other birds as well. In the early 1900s, miners began taking canaries into the coal mines because the birds were highly sensitive to toxic gases like carbon monoxide. And if the birds keeled over, it meant that the air had become unsafe for miners. Today, our wild birds are the canaries in the coal mine that alert us to environmental harms through their declining populations or their failure to thrive. Because birds are so visible and vocal, it's relatively easy for us to monitor them and determine if their populations are doing well or declining. And when birds are disappearing, it behooves us to figure out why. Because if we can resolve a problem that's impacting birds, we very often end up helping other organisms that are being harmed as well, including, quite often, us. The peregrine falcon is a top-level predator that feeds mainly on birds, and it's found on every continent except for Antarctica. It occurs in a wide variety of open habitats, from the Arctic tundra to mountain and desert canyons, from coastal cliffs to some of our biggest cities like Chicago and New York. Today, peregrines are typically found wherever there are suitable nest sites, which consist of high ledges on cliffs, buildings, or structures like bridges. The falcons don't breed in Florida, as I'm sure most of you know, but they do pass through the state during migration season. So hopefully you get to see them at least occasionally. Today, peregrines are widespread, but years ago, beginning in the 1950s, the birds began disappearing at an alarming rate. Their disappearance was first confirmed by a British biologist named Derek Ratcliffe, who completed peregrine surveys in England in 1962. He discovered abandoned peregrine territories and found broken eggs in peregrine nests, and he realized that the birds weren't successfully raising young. After hearing about the dramatic decline of peregrines in Britain, a US biologist named Joe Hickey, who was a student of Aldo Leopold's and who wrote the first ever guide to birdwatching, which I'm sure is of interest to many of us, he launched a peregrine survey in the eastern US in 1964. During that summer, biologists checked virtually every known territory, peregrine territory, east of the Mississippi River, from Alabama up to Nova Scotia, and they didn't find a single peregrine. The eastern peregrine had completely disappeared. A follow-up conference in Madison, Wisconsin in 1965 brought together scientists, falconers, and naturalists from around the world. Peregrine declines were reported from 36 countries on 5 continents, and biologists were soon calling the collapse of peregrine populations an ecological disaster. At the conference, several British scientists presented preliminary evidence that pesticides might be involved in peregrine declines. A new pesticide known as DDT had been used very successfully in World War II to control insect-borne diseases, and it had come into widespread use after the war to combat agricultural and forest insect pests. The British scientists showed that peregrines had disappeared from areas where DDT and other toxic pesticides were being heavily used. And this was admittedly tenuous evidence, but it nevertheless inspired many Madison Conference attendees to go on to study the effects of pesticides on peregrines. Other attendees, including Tom Cade, who worked at Cornell University and later founded the nonprofit organization called the Peregrine Fund, were eager to see if they could breed peregrines in captivity. That seems like a no-brainer to us nowadays, but this hadn't been done before for peregrines or for any other endangered birds at the time. So if captive breeding worked, these biologists hoped to reintroduce peregrines to the wild in places where pesticide use was less prevalent. These two approaches, research and policy work on DDT and captive breeding and reintroduction of falcons, ultimately became the two prongs of a massive conservation effort to save the peregrine falcon. Captive breeding was eventually successful, and peregrine reintroductions began in the eastern US in 1974. By the time I headed to Wyoming in 1991, for my first summer of field work as a biologist, releasing captive bred peregrines to the wild, the falcon had been reintroduced successfully to the east, and reintroductions were just ramping up in the west. I'd only camped a few times when my field partner and I found ourselves living out of a tent in grizzly bear country near Cody, Wyoming, which is a gateway to Yellowstone National Park. We spent our first week of work monitoring and feeding 5 captive reared falcons that had been driven to our release site at the age of 5 weeks and placed in a large plywood box known as a hack box. We had 3 males and 2 females, and as is true for many birds of prey, the females were larger than the males. Each bird wore a differently colored leg band so that we could identify them. And being a budding young scientist, I wanted to be objective and name the birds after their color bands, so sort of red, yellow, green. But my field partner overruled me and named them after Egyptian gods and mythological figures. So when I read a passage in a few moments, you'll know where those names came from. The hack box was anchored to the top of a small set of cliffs, about a 30-minute hike from our camp. And each day we fed the falcons dead quail, and we took notes on the birds' activities and growth. On release day, our supervisor removed the front of the box so that the birds could fly free. And in these types of reintroductions, the first 24 hours post-release are critical, and a lot can go wrong. For example, a peregrine in Washington State flew out of the hack box, got carried aloft on a rising column of air, a thermal, and was never seen again. We also had to worry about predators like golden eagles and great horned owls, and even adult peregrines, which could target the inexperienced young falcons as they took their first flights. Our peregrines all left the box within the first few hours, and luckily all stayed nearby initially. Unfortunately, though, during an afternoon thunderstorm, a side door blew shut with a bang and flushed the birds. They scattered into a violent wind and disappeared. All but one eventually made it back to the vicinity of the hack box by that first night, but you'll have to read the book to find out if our missing peregrine returned. Each day we provided food for our birds and scared away potential predators using noisemakers. And over time, and we watched the young birds from dawn to dusk every day. And over time, we really began to see their personalities emerge. The greatest joy of the whole summer was watching these young peregrines learn to fly. We documented their first hesitant flights and their wobbly landings. And we watched them as they mastered their wings and learned how to use the wind. So I'll just read a 2-page excerpt from Feather Trails to describe what it was like to watch these birds. This is the longest passage I'll read. It's about 4 minutes long. So get comfy and settle in. The birds also spent more time soaring on updrafts of air, joining other raptors and tracing effortless circular paths on these invisible sky elevators. Most entertaining for us, our peregrines began fine-tuning their flight skills and developing their nascent predatory tendencies with endless pursuits and mock battles. Just as playing kittens developed the agility and strength to catch fleet and elusive prey, so too did the falcons' tireless aerial games fine-tune their bodies to respond to the evasive flights of the shorebirds, songbirds, and waterfowl that evolved over the eons to dodge the speed-made predators that hunted them. Though the wild chases had a playful air, these flights, this practice, would determine whether our peregrines became successful hunters and survivors, or whether they went hungry and perished. Evenings and mornings were now filled with the falcon's screams and aerial exploits as one bird streamed after another like a small fighter plane locked onto a fast-moving target. The pursued bird dodged and rolled, tucked its wings, and fell earthward in ever more sophisticated evasive maneuvers. Becoming one with the sky, the peregrines flew with ineffable grace, dazzling speed, and breathtaking agility. As I watched their transcendent flights, I felt my own heart quicken. Transported by the falcon's inimitable aerial prowess, I could almost feel the wind stream behind me, feel every subtle movement of wing or tail that determined my trajectory, my speed, my effortless engagement with the wind. All the while, earthbound, I dispassionately scribbled my field notes, recording our falcon's flights while never taking my eyes off the birds as they traced invisible loops across the firmament, imprinting their movements, their exuberance, their vitality forever in my mind's eye, and lifting my spirits in ways that only such epiphanic sights in nature can. Small wonder that legendary raptor expert Leslie Brown called the unmatched and unmatchable peregrine the prince of all flying birds. Now Ra launched from the cliff top and with strong wing beats chased after Isis, who had glided over him, trailing an invisible weight that seemed to pull the young male into motion. Climbing above her, he screamed a challenge, then drew in his wings and dropped toward her at a steep angle. Cacking in protest, Isis tucked a wing, fell away sideways, and rolled over, presenting her ferocious talons. Undaunted, Ra extended his legs and grabbed Isis's talons in his own. Briefly, the two cartwheeled through the sky, their screams echoing off the cliffs and ricocheting over the valley. Seconds later, they released each other, and Isis circled over the cliff before extending her wings, flaring her tail, and landing with an almost imperceptible wobble. And then another tiercel, those are young males, materialized out of the clouds, and the pursuer became the pursued. Drawing his wings close to his body, Osiris dropped toward Ra with breathtaking speed and an agility that the larger-bodied, proportionately shorter-winged Isis could never match. Undaunted, Ra dropped to his side, cacking fiercely as Osiris shot harmlessly past him. Leveling out, Ra flapped his wings, found an updraft, and shot skyward. Circling briefly, he dived at Osiris, and the two sped like nanojets out of view behind the cliffs. Ever watchful and attuned to the world around him, Gawain tilted his head to the right, then left, keeping a close eye on Ra and Osiris's antics from the cliff top as Isis preened assiduously beside him. His large eyes seemed to take in the entirety of the heavens, and he watched his fellow Tirsos long after I had lost them from view. Although the open skies were now a significant component of our falcon's world, our view of the birds was all too often blocked by cliffs, rocks, trees, and hills. But even when I could no longer see our falcons, the trails they had blazed across the sky still lingered in my mind, and the peregrine's surreal speed and arresting acrobatics, even at this young age, left me awed. Our summer had plenty of adventures, including one of our birds being attacked by a golden eagle, but about 5 weeks after their release, the falcons began to disperse as they learned to hunt for themselves. By 6 weeks post-release, we rarely saw them. After they reached independence, they spent several more months fine-tuning their hunting skills before embarking on their first migration. Our Rocky Mountain peregrines were likely to spend their first winter in Mexico, but the northernmost tundra breeding peregrines fly as far as southern Argentina or Chile for the austral summer. About half of juvenile peregrines survive their first year. Radio trackings have shown that some of these falcons are killed by predators. Others might die in collisions with cars, buildings, or power lines, and some die in storms or are lost at sea. I could only hope that my peregrines were successful, since I never learned their fates, but my time working with them was a life-transforming experience that inspired me to dedicate my career to helping birds. Over time, peregrine reintroductions like mine, which occurred all over North America, were wildly successful. Nearly 7,000 peregrines were reintroduced to the wild in the US and Canada, and the falcons began to recolonize their former nesting territories. But what really allowed the peregrine falcon to recover was the banning of DDT in 1972. As a top predator, peregrines killed a variety of birds that had fed on invertebrates, vegetation, or seeds that had been contaminated by DDT. And by consuming lots of these birds over time, the peregrines accumulated large amounts of DDE, which is a breakdown product of DDT, in their bodies. And this affected their calcium production, which led to the birds laying thin-shelled eggs. Fish-eating birds like ospreys and bald eagles and brown pelicans also accumulated DDE in their bodies. All of these birds inadvertently crushed their eggs while incubating them, so they couldn't successfully raise any young, which ultimately led to huge population declines. It took many years of dying birds, scientific studies, environmental advocacy, the first ever environmental lawsuits, and several high-profile public hearings before DDT was finally banned. But rather than learn from the lessons that peregrines and other birds taught us, today we're experiencing a similar type of environmental catastrophe with a new class of pesticides known as neonicotinoids, or neonics for short. Neonics are less acutely toxic to vertebrates like birds than DDT was, but they're far, far more toxic to insects. And their widespread use has contributed to what many have dubbed an insect apocalypse. We're currently experiencing an ecologically catastrophic disappearance of insects. Neonics are known as systemic insecticides, meaning they're absorbed by a plant's roots and leaves, making the entire plant toxic. So insects that feed on any part of the plant, including its fruits and flowers, either die or are debilitated. Neonics are highly soluble in water, so they're transported by runoff from terrestrial to aquatic environments where they can contaminate our surface waters and groundwater. These pesticides are widely used in agriculture. Seeds of more than 140 crops are coated with neonicotinoids before being planted. And although neonics are less toxic to vertebrates than some of the pesticides that preceded them, a single corn seed treated with imidacloprid, which is one of the oldest and most widely used of the neonics, can kill a bird the size of a blue jay. Consuming lesser amounts of the pesticide can disrupt a songbird's ability to reproduce. So they still have a negative quite a negative impact on birds. More than anything, though, it's the disappearance of insects on which so many birds feed that's the biggest cause for alarm. Over time, neonics have had tremendous impacts on our ecosystems. Neonics are toxic to the earthworms and the organisms in our soils, to the aquatic invertebrates that feed our fish, to the bees and butterflies that pollinate our plants, and to the insects that sustain our birds and bats. So despite the dramatic lessons of the DDT era, where once again overusing a class of pesticides whose impacts are widespread but still poorly understood. The European Union banned the use of some of these pesticides in 2018. Here in the US, though, we've been much slower to tackle the problem. There's still no federal regulations limiting the use of neonicotinoids, but a growing number of cities and a dozen or so states now are starting to curtail or even ban their use. But to return to peregrines, the species is doing well for now, although I have to add an unfortunate caveat that there's recent concern that the falcon's being hard hit by the avian flu. That said, the fastest animal in the world was removed from the US endangered species list in 1999, and there are now about 3,000 peregrine falcon pairs in North America. So this has been a real conservation success story. Unfortunately, things haven't gone as well for the second species that I write about, the Hawaiian crow, or alala, as it's also known, and I'll use these names interchangeably. Most people are astonished to hear that any crow anywhere is critically endangered. Most of us know crows to be opportunistic and very well able to cope with people and their habitat modifications. But crows that live on islands, and especially those that depend on forested habitats, are some of our most endangered birds. The Hawaiian crow is the most endangered corvid in the world. Corvids are members of the crow, raven, jay, and nutcracker family, as many of you know. Despite its name, the Hawaiian crow is more closely related to the common raven than it is to the American crow. It occurs only on the island of Hawaii, which is also known as the Big Island, and it resides there in the cloud forest. A good portion of the alala's forested habitat was destroyed first by Polynesian and then by European colonizers and the animals that they brought with them. In more recent times, in the 1900s, many of the crows were shot. Their numbers were also impacted by introduced predators and diseases. Hawaiian birds evolved on islands that had no mammals except for bats and no reptiles. Their only native predator was the Hawaiian hawk, or the eo, as it's also known. But people introduced rats and mongooses and domestic cats, all of which prey on Hawaiian birds that never evolved to cope with these kinds of predators. The rats can readily climb trees and consume bird eggs and nestlings. And if the Hawaiian crow nestlings could survive and leave their nests successfully, they typically spent their first few weeks on the ground unable to fly before they learned to fly. And the strategy worked well in an environment with no mammalian predators, but in a world with cats and mongooses, the fledglings were acutely vulnerable to being killed. Outdoor cats, both feral and domestic, also are an additional threat because they carry and transmit diseases. Toxoplasmosis is a cat-transmitted disease that's dangerous to wildlife and people. The parasite that causes this disease, Toxoplasma gondii, is a single-celled organism that reproduces in feline intestines. It's excreted in cat feces in the form of oocysts, which are single egg-like cells, and it's eventually ingested by an intermediate host, like a rat or a person. The parasite then settles in the form of cysts in the host's brain, affecting the brain's neural circuitry. So infected rats lose their fear of cats and they become easy prey again, restarting the parasite's ingenious and somewhat horrifying cycle. Toxoplasma oocysts that aren't ingested can remain in the environment for a long time. They're very persistent. Because of runoff, they can contaminate aquatic as well as terrestrial environments. Worldwide, toxoplasmosis is one of the most common human parasitic infections. People can become infected when eating contaminated vegetables or undercooked meat, or when cleaning their cat's litter box if they have an outdoor cat, or even by weeding a garden that's being visited by cats. Growing evidence suggests that the disease may be associated with a variety of mental disorders, including depression, bipolar disorder, and schizophrenia. It's also harmed wildlife, killing several alalas and at least 14 critically endangered monk seals. Hawaii's birds have also been decimated by mosquitoes, which were introduced to the islands in 1826 and became disease vectors that transmitted avian pox and avian malaria, which are two introduced diseases that have been fatal to many of Hawaii's birds. These diseases are the major reason why Hawaii now has a dubious honor of being called the extinction capital of the world. Many of its native birds, including some of its renowned honey creepers, a few of which I've pictured here, will die after contracting malaria from a single mosquito bite. Most of the native birds that now remain in Hawaii only live at higher elevations where it's cooler and there are fewer mosquitoes. But in our warming climate, mosquitoes can thrive at higher elevations, and soon there's going to be no mosquito-free habitat left for Hawaii's birds. As birds have shown us, introduced organisms, which have especially plagued islands but have been a scourge worldwide, threaten native wildlife, habitats, and humanity. They degrade biodiversity, cause extinctions, and worldwide cost us about $423 billion a year. When I worked on the Hawaiian Crow Recovery Project in the early 1990s, there were only 12 wild alala left. I was tasked with monitoring the first 5 captive reared alala to be released to the wild. These juvenile crows had come from eggs that were laid in the wild, and then they were raised in captivity. The nestling crows were transported from the captive breeding facility to the release site and kept in a hack box for several weeks. That's the upper wooden portion of the structure that you're looking at. So they were kept in the hack box before being released into an attached aviary. And after about a month in the aviary, they were released to the wild. I arrived about a week after their release to work with the birds. And this was my first impression upon arriving at the release site. A minute later, we pulled off the road into a clearing that held an aviary so immense, so spectacular, that I simply stared at it, wondering at the work that went into enclosing full-size trees in a fortress that was as impenetrable to outsiders as it had been accommodating to its prior occupants. We stepped out of the vehicle onto the wet grass. And then, through the mist, came a strangely euphonic medley of throaty, echoing screams, intermixed with rumbled growls and haunting, evocative wails. I felt my neck prickle. The eerie, commanding sound seemed to drift out of the floating fog, seemed to embody the lost voices of the trees, the ferns, the vines, released at last from their cellulose prisons. I was hearing the most prominent and unforgettable voice of the Hawaiian cloud forest, that of the alala, as the Hawaiians dubbed their singular crow. The bird's native name means cry like a child, but the crow's varied, penetrating, ventriloquistic vocalizations could only come from a child of an otherworldly forest, a creature of a more primal time and place. I stood transfixed, irrevocably moved by the strange but captivating sounds, which washed over me like a turbulent wind that spoke of an uncertain future, yet felt full of promise. And I thought, 12. Aside from the young reintroduced Hawaiian crows that I was hearing and was about to meet for the first time, only 12 alala remained in the wild, 12 birds to fill these forests with their astonishingly distinctive vocal repertoires, 12 birds to embody the lost world that lingered in this enigmatic place, 12 birds to carry this unique and intriguing species into the future. For a moment, I felt the full weight and the privilege of the task on which I was about to embark. Along with a field partner, I was tasked with tracking the newly released crows through the cloud forest. They were outfitted with radio transmitters on their tails and monitoring their behavior. In addition, we provided supplemental food for them until they could feed on their own. The crows quickly learned to forage for themselves. Alala eat a wide variety of forest fruits, and they're really important seed dispersers in the Hawaiian cloud forest. They also feed on insects, which they find under flakes of bark or in clusters of leaves, and they probe flower blossoms for nectar. The Alala were remarkable. In addition to being very vocal, they were funny, playful, and incredibly engaging. They're also really intelligent. They're one of the few bird species that can use tools to secure difficult to reach food items. The crows often forage the way they're doing in this photo by hanging on the tips of branches, and they sometimes engaged in entertaining foot fights where they'd grab each other's feet and then push and pull at each other until one of the birds fell off the perch they were on. So I'll just read a short section that describes an intriguing interaction between our two male crows, Kehau and Malama, which were two brothers. 5 days into my work with Yalala, I set out on a gray morning to follow Kehau and Malama, but I felt under the weather. To my surprise, it quickly became apparent that Malama felt that way too. As the other crows busily hopped along branches, poking their bills under bark and into ohia blossoms, Malama rested, perching quietly and preening sporadically. Fortunately, the other Alala stayed nearby, moving from tree to tree as they foraged. Upon completing yet another behavioral scan, I noted with growing concern that I had recorded Malama sleeping several times, a highly unusual morning behavior. Kehau appeared to be as puzzled as I was by his erstwhile companion's actions. Sidling up to Malama, he made soft mewing calls, then gently preened his sibling's head and neck and delicately nibbled his face. When his ministrations failed to arouse the subdued bird, Kehau plucked an unopened koa flower bud, part of a berry-like cluster that would open into a creamy white powder puff blossom, and pushed it carefully into Malama's back feathers with his bill. No response. Kehau cocked his head, watching Malama, then stretched out his neck, plucked another globular koa bud, and again stashed it with cautious deliberation into Malama's plumage. Still no response. Kehau repeated the process again, and still Malama failed to react. Tilting his head, Kehau looked at Malama, murmuring quietly to him. Finally, Malama fluffed out his body feathers and shook them, a comfort behavior known as rousing that often follows about a preening, and dislodged the buds, but he remained on his perch, staring at the ground. Malama had in fact contracted avian malaria, but luckily we were able to get him medical help, and we spent a week treating him for the disease. Perhaps my favorite thing about the Alala, as you might have gathered already, was the bird's extraordinary voice. The crow has more than 60 different types of calls, and to me, it's truly the voice of the Hawaiian cloud forest. Today, despite numerous reintroductions and years of effort, Hawaii's forests are silent, and the crows only exist in captivity. They're currently extinct in the wild. Surprisingly, one of the greatest challenges to the bird's recovery has been that Hawaiian hawks have killed so many of the reintroduced birds. Although the two species coexisted for eons, the balance between the alala and its native predator has been upended. Plans are now underway for reintroducing alala to the island of Maui, where the EO doesn't occur, and these reintroductions are slated to begin this year. Some of the captive raised birds have already been transferred to the release site on Maui, and hopefully they should be released within the next few weeks. In addition, an experimental biocontrol is being used to try to reduce mosquito numbers. So as heartbreaking as the alala's story is, there's still hope for this captivating bird. And I hope that people will read about it and come to care about this really unique crow, since the bird's future now depends entirely on us. The California Condors story is much better known, but we generally hear more about recovery efforts in California, and I focus more on condor reintroductions in Arizona. This is the third species that I write about in Feather Trails. The California condor is a member of the New World vulture family, and it's the largest terrestrial land bird in North America with a wingspan of about 9.5 feet. And you can really get an appreciation of its size when you see it flying next to this raven, which if you've ever been close to a raven, they look very large, except for next to a condor. During the Pleistocene era, more than 10,000 years ago, California condors ranged from British Columbia down to Mexico and as far east as Florida and New York State. Their range contracted with the extinction of the Pleistocene megafauna, which included animals like Columbian mammoths and these bizarre-looking giant ground sloths, which I've pictured here. By the 1900s, condors were largely restricted to California. This was their core range in Southern California until the 1980s. But scattered reports also exist of condors occurring outside of California until the 1920s. One of the areas where condors also occurred was the Grand Canyon region. Condors were abundant in this area during the Pleistocene era, and they also occurred in Arizona in historic times. For example, 2 condors were seen near the west side of today's Grand Canyon National Park in 1881, and the last sighting of a condor in Arizona was in 1924 near Williams, Arizona, just south of the Grand Canyon. Condors declined precipitously during the 1800s and 1900s, and when biologists conducted the first full population count in 1982, they were shocked to discover that there were only 22 condors left in existence, 21 in the wild and 1 in captivity. The birds had been disappearing for decades, and biologists really weren't sure why. Habitat loss and persecution seemed like likely suspects. They often are. Many people shot condors, and the birds were also killed indirectly when they fed on poisoned carcasses that people had put out to kill predators like wolves and coyotes and grizzly bears. But after biologists began tracking condors that they'd outfitted with radio transmitters on their wings, they discovered several condors that had died of lead poisoning after ingesting lead ammunition fragments found in the carcasses that they had fed on. When lead bullets are shot into a carcass, they lose about 30% of their mass and fragment into tiny particles, which are then inadvertently consumed by whatever feeds on that animal. It wasn't until years after the first lead poison condor was discovered in 1984 that biologists really began to appreciate the severity of this threat to condors. Meanwhile, in the 1980s, condors were disappearing fast. After 6 condors disappeared over just one winter, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service decided to capture the last few birds that were left in the wild to keep them safe and to bolster a captive breeding program. The last wild condor, which was known as AC-9, was captured and brought into captivity in 1987. And at the time, this was an incredibly controversial and heartbreaking event, since it meant that for the first time in tens of thousands of years, condors no longer flew over North America, and there was really no guarantee that they ever would again. Fortunately, though, captive breeding, which was initiated in 1982, was very successful. And the first reintroductions of captive reared condors began in California in 1992. This is a photo of the first 2 condors that were released to the wild. And then in Arizona at the Vermilion Cliffs, which are just north of the Grand Canyon, in 1996. I joined the condor recovery effort as the field manager of the Arizona reintroduction effort in 2000. And in addition to releasing condors to the wild, my job, along with my field crew, was to monitor the birds and keep them safe. This is the flight pen that we held condors in on top of the Vermilion Cliffs before we released them. And this is the smaller release pen that was right on the rim of the Vermilion Cliffs. After releasing condors to the wild, we taught them to roost in places that were safe from predators like coyotes, and we taught them to stay away from people by harassing them if they perched in inappropriate places. So on a roof looking into a window was considered an inappropriate place. Working with condors was a delight. The birds are gregarious, they're intelligent, and they're very, very playful. So I'll just read two quick excerpts that might show you a different side of this enormous vulture than some of you might expect. In the meantime, though, when transmitter signals indicated that a large group of condors was clustered together, I invariably looked for a carcass or a source of entertainment. After locating 11 condors on the Badger Canyon beach, I quickly surveyed the scene and breathed a sigh of relief when I saw no people, no boats, and no tents. Binoculars glued to my eyes, I sat back to enjoy the show. 2 condors played tug of war with a branch that had washed ashore. Others walked up and down a drift log, jostling for prime positions. Several paddled in an eddy at the river's edge, then sent water flying skyward as they bathed. Suddenly, Condor 196 emerged from a mid-beach condor scrum, holding an irresistible prize aloft in her bill, a plastic 1-gallon jug. She took off at a run, the other condors in hot pursuit, but with a sudden smack, 196 rammed face first into a boulder. Momentarily stunned, she sat back on her legs, still holding the jug that had obscured her view. Regaining her balance, 196 scrambled to her feet and ran on as the other condors closed in. Minutes later, 1-year-old Condor 227 commandeered the jug and flung it skyward with his bill. When it landed unexpectedly on his back, 227 leaped in mock fright and turned on his attacker. Seeming captivated by this new twist on the game, 227 again flung the opaque monster skyward, whereupon it fell back down and again landed on his back. Unnoticed on my distant clifftop perch, I laughed out loud, as captivated by the condor's activities as the birds were by their frenzied play. And this next excerpt gives you an insight into how intelligent condors are. The condor's notable but unsung intelligence was underscored for me one evening when biologist Chris Leitner returned to the field house and described Condor 127's solo play with an empty plastic bottle on the Badger Beach. Exhibiting World Cup dexterity, 127 repeatedly punted the bottle down the beach with her bill and chased after it. As she pursued it, the bottle moved closer and closer to the river's edge until the water suddenly caught it and whisked it downstream. In vain, 127 ran along the shoreline, eyes fixed on the bobbing bottle. Just when it seemed lost to her, the current swept the bottle into an eddy several feet from the riverbank. Without hesitation, 127 waded into the water and reached out to retrieve her toy, but it floated just out of reach. Looking around, 127 spotted a partially submerged boulder beyond the bottle. Extending her wings, she hopped out onto the boulder. Now, by stretching her neck, she could just reach the bottle. Nudging it with her beak, she gave it a push shoreward. As it floated toward the beach, she hopped into the water and gave it another nudge, and then another. As the bottle touched solid ground, 127 resumed her frenzied play, punting it down the beach. I know it's anthropomorphizing, Chris remarked, but 127 seemed crushed when she lost her bottle, and she seemed so excited when she was able to retrieve it and could play with it again. As entertained as I was by Chris's story, I was equally struck by 127's intelligence. No level of rote, trial-by-error learning had enabled 127 to retrieve her toy. Instead, she had engaged in multiple steps to enact an outcome that she had envisioned, figuring out how to reach the bottle, then pushing her prize shoreward and counterintuitively away from her, step by careful step, so she could gain control of it again. On a more somber note, the most critical aspect of my job was keeping condors alive, since they were at constant risk from ingesting lead ammunition in the carcasses that they found. Lead ammunition is the single greatest threat to condors. And to be clear, this is not a hunting issue. Hunting actually helps condors because it provides the birds with so many carcass remains on the landscape. Instead, it's solely an ammunition issue. If it weren't for lead ammunition, condors would be thriving. They're actually a very opportunistic and successful species otherwise. The black and white specks that you see in these x-rays of a shot deer on one side and the coyote on the other are lead fragments. So you can see how birds that feed on these kinds of carcasses could ingest small particles of lead, which are enough to poison them. If we suspected that condors had fed on a carcass containing lead ammunition, we had to recapture them and we tested their blood for lead and then treated them for lead poisoning if necessary. The treatment is known as chelation therapy, and it involves injecting condors twice a day for 5 days in their breast muscle with a substance that binds the lead and removes it from the body. In some years, 95% of condors in Arizona have been exposed to lead, with most of those requiring chelation. One condor in California had lead poisoning 13 times, which meant that it received at least 130 chelation injections. And each time the bird has to be netted and handled and injected. So it's an incredibly stressful procedure for the birds and the handlers too. And although some condors are saved through chelation, lead poisoning is the way that roughly 2/3 of the reintroduced condors have died. Other scavengers like eagles and ravens are also poisoned when they ingest lead ammunition in carcasses. In a long-term study of 38 states, nearly half of bald eagles and golden eagles had chronic lead poisoning, and lead levels were significantly higher during the hunting season. So what about people who eat hunter-killed game meat? Are they vulnerable too? To investigate this, a North Dakota doctor x-rayed packages of venison, 100 packages of venison that had been donated to food banks by hunters in 2007, local food banks. 59% of the packages that he x-rayed contained visible lead fragments. And this is a photo of some of those packages. The white flecks that you see in the meat are bits of lead. When other states x-rayed the venison that had been donated to their food banks, they also found alarming lead levels. Despite these findings years ago, food bank donations of hunter-killed game meat are still unregulated, and donor organizations don't require their hunters to use non-lead ammunition. So we worry about lead in our pipes and in our children's toys, and yet every year, hunters are donating millions of pounds of game meat shot with lead to those in need and eating such meat themselves and feeding it to their families. This kind of lead consumption could be having profoundly negative health and societal outcomes. Scores of medical doctors and public health experts have highlighted the human health threat posed by lead ammunition and called for the use of safer types of ammunition for hunting. Non-lead bullets that don't fragment are now widely available. No level of lead is considered safe for people, and the toxic effects of lead are largely irreversible. Despite that, hunter advocacy groups like the NRA say there's no cause for concern. We've always hunted with lead ammunition, hunted with lead bullets for years, and no one's ever been harmed by them. But the effects of lead can be subtle, and they're often attributed to other causes. For example, in adults, chronic lead effects can include high blood pressure, decreased kidney function, and reproductive issues such as impotence, infertility, and miscarriages. Lead exposure can cause digestive problems and muscle and joint pain. It may be related to cognitive decline and dementia in older adults, and it also affects longevity. In children, lead can lower IQ levels and lead to learning disabilities and a higher frequency of aggressive and delinquent behavior. Lead exposure has also been linked to criminality. A number of studies attribute the widespread decline of violent crime in the 1990s to the phasing out of leaded gasoline, in the late 70s and early 80s. But we still have no idea if and how lead ammunition might be contributing to the violence, crime, and extremism that we see in the US today. And I think that this definitely bears investigation. We're very good at ignoring the warning signs that things in our environment are dangerous to us. We've known that lead bullet fragments are poisoning California condors since the 1980s, and it's hard to imagine a bigger canary in the coal mine, but that's exactly what we've been doing. Things are starting to change, fortunately. For the sake of condors, California banned the use of lead ammunition beginning in 2019, which was a great start. But no other state has done that. And it's remarkable how rarely we hear about the human health impacts of lead ammunition. I increasingly see state game agencies asking their hunters to use non-lead bullets to help wildlife, but I've never seen any of them mention the human health threat of lead ammunition. Despite the perils of lead, though, there were many, many high points during my work with condors, and I write about them in detail in Feather Trails. In 2001, I was fortunate to document the first egg laid in the wild by reintroduced condors. News of Condor 119's famous egg was broadcast all over the country, and even the world, actually. And Discover magazine included this event in their list of the top 100 science stories in 2001. I also had the good fortune of monitoring Arizona's first condor chick. Condor 305 had the chance to be the first nestling raised by reintroduced condors to fledge in the wild. And I won't spoil the book by letting you know if this historic fledging happened, but I will say that it was an incredible roller coaster getting to this point in Arizona, and events were even more challenging in California. Despite the existential threat that lead ammunition poses to condors, reintroductions and intensive management have significantly bolstered condor population numbers since their low point of 22 birds. Condors are now reproducing successfully in the wild, and they're reclaiming more and more of their former range. So thanks to the Endangered Species Act and thousands of dedicated people, these three incredible species are still with us today. The peregrine falcon is one of our biggest conservation success stories. It taught us that the best way to recover a species is to eliminate its main threat. In the case of peregrines, that was the pesticide DDT. Not eliminating the main threat to a species undermines its recovery, as we've seen with the California condor, which still requires intensive management. But if we replace lead ammunition with non-lead substitutes, we'll be able to save the condor too. We're well on our way, at least. The Hawaiian crow faces multiple complex threats, which inevitably makes its recovery more challenging. In addition, funding and recovery efforts were inadequate for many decades until it was almost too late. Hawaiian birds, which are some of our most endangered birds, are still underfunded compared to the mainland species. But the peregrine and other recovered birds have shown us that targeted conservation efforts really do work. We've had tremendous success recovering endangered species, but along the way, we've also come to appreciate that our best conservation strategy is to keep common birds common and keep them from becoming endangered in the first place. And that's where I think all of us, bird lovers like us, can come in. At last count, the US Fish and Wildlife Service estimated that 96 million of us watch and enjoy birds. So if we all did a few small things to help them, we might be able to turn their numbers, their declining population numbers around. For example, we can keep our cats indoors. That's probably the best thing we can do to help birds, and it also helps protect us from toxoplasmosis. We can put decals on our windows to prevent bird collisions, avoid using pesticides. We can grow native plants and foster habitat around our homes, use non-lead ammunition when we hunt, and support our public lands and bird conservation organizations, just to name a few ways we can help. There are countless other ways to help our local birds, and I try to provide suggestions whenever I write about birds. So those miners who used canaries in the coal mine to alert them to bad air, well, many of them became attached to the vibrant bits of color and life down in the mines, and they didn't want the birds to die. So when the canaries struggled for air, the miners enclosed them in an airtight cage attached to an oxygen tank to revive their feathered companions. Conservationist Thomas Lovejoy said, quote, "If you take care of birds, you take care of most of the environmental problems in the world. By helping birds, we not only enrich our own lives by supporting the bird life around us, but we're also likely to resolve a variety of environmental problems, and in the process, help a host of other creatures that live on the planet, including us." So thanks to you all for listening, and thank you for everything that you're doing to help birds. I'm so impressed by how amazing your chapter is and all you've been doing. My book, Feather Trails, is available online and in bookstores. It's currently available in hardback, Audible, and Kindle. And you can also find more of my writings on the Substack platform or on my website. So I am happy to take any questions. I threw a lot of information at you during that. So oops, I'll leave it on that.
Thank you so much, Sophie. That was incredible. And I mean, you're so inspiring. You've done so much, and I really love how you left it on, actions that we all can take and a positive note, and especially that full circle story about the canary that it inspires hope in a lot of us, which I think is what we all need.
We need it. Yes.
Yeah, so I am just going to go through some of the questions. So as we're talking, Scott put in the chat, if you do have any questions for Sophie about the presentation or about her book, please go ahead and put those in the chat. Helen was wondering, do you have an audio recording of the Hawaiian Crow?
I have a cassette tape that the Fish and Wildlife Service people I worked with made for me. They intermixed Hawaiian songs with some of our radio traffic and the sound of all our birds. And I need to figure out how I can get it off that cassette tape and onto, a CD or something that other people can listen to, because the noises are so extraordinary. I have tried to find their calls online and they just do not do them justice. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service used to have an entire section of their website dedicated to the Hawaiian Crow's voice, and that had some great calls, but they got rid of it, and I don't know why they did. Macaulay Library with Cornell, they have a bunch of recordings, and they show quite a variety of calls. They're definitely worth listening to. They're really, some of them are just amazing. But to me, they still didn't capture just some of the incredible diversity and just wild noises that these birds made. I cannot be like some of these people who can imitate bird calls, but I remember John Marsluff used to call one of the bird calls the James Brown call, and that would wake us up in the morning sometimes. And one of the adult males would especially make it, I think, to sort of mark their territories and things, and they would go, ow, ow, and the whole forest would just ring with this just crazy, ow. And but they were also just wild noises. And at night the birds would have these whispering murmurations that were so comforting and sweet, and sounded like little mewing noises, little zipper noises. So anyway, I wish I had more to share with you. I should try to get some to attach to this talk, because their vocalizations were just the best.
Yeah, they sound amazing in such a range. So, and I'm sure nothing beats being there, but that's still, so at least some good resources to check into.
Exactly.
Thanks for your question, Helen. Carol was wondering, another great question, of course. The transmitters look quite large and long. Do condors and other large birds try to pull at their transmitters, or the transmitters of other birds?
That is a really good question. They do, when they first get put on, they will preen them more, and they'll manipulate them a little bit, but they really very quickly, it's quite astonishing how they just get used to it, and it just becomes part of their plumage, and they don't really seem to notice it after that. And they rarely mess with each other's. They're pretty good at nibbling at each other's faces and preening each other, but they usually don't mess with their antennas. So I think we're lucky that way.
Right. Yeah, that's amazing, being as smart and curious as they are. And that's so neat that you got to have all of those experiences with them.
Yeah, I think it just sort of becomes part of their plumage. So, and they all have them. So they all, I think it's just, they get used to it, I guess.
Yeah. Maybe it's like your pet wearing a collar or something.
Exactly. I think
most
it is
of them
a
get
lot
used
like that.
Yeah. Many comments about how wonderful your presentation was. They had to leave, but thank you so for your presentation and everything you've done. I like Mark's idea, is try playing the cassette and record on the phone might help. That kind of makes me think of like back in the 80s when we were trying to record things off of the radio with cassette. But
that's actually a great idea.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Martin was wondering, is the problem that honeybees are having Is that also related to the insecticide, the nicotide that you mentioned?
Yes, apparently it is. Apparently the colony collapse disorder is, it's not, I don't know if they know if it's 100% caused by neonicotinoids, because I know there were some mite issues, and it's just a very complicated problem, but they do think that neonicotinoids are a contributing factor to the colony collapse disorder. If nothing else, it's causing a lot of stress and affecting the immune responses of the bees. So it's definitely a problem, and it is a contributor.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Scott.
Great
Or I'm sorry,
question.
that was Martin. Thanks, Martin. Scott was wondering, thank you for enlightening us on the dangers of toxoplasmosis. Are there any efforts to educate the public more on this relatively unknown danger posed by outdoor cats?
I really just, it's one of those things, kind of like the human health threat posed by lead ammunition, that I almost never hear about. There was a great book written called Cat Wars that really went into the toxoplasmosis issue, and that's where I did a lot of my research and learned about it initially. But I really don't think that bird advocates are talking about it enough, because it is a really terrible problem. When people do hear about it is if anybody in your life gets pregnant and has a cat and goes to the vet, veterinarians almost always mention toxoplasmosis, because pregnant women can pass it to the fetus and it can cause fetal abnormalities and miscarriages. So it's very dangerous for pregnant women. So veterinarians will always say, if you're pregnant, don't do your cat's litter box. But they don't tell you that if you're out weeding your garden, the oocysts can become aerosolized, and just weeding a garden, you could get toxoplasmosis. And I really wish that they would, just people in general would talk about this issue more, which is why I tried to bring it up, because many of us have neighbors who let their cats out, even if we don't. And it's just it's a huge problem. We're basically subjected to other people's cats coming into our yards, and aside from harassing our birds, defecating in our yards and potentially causing this disease. For a long time, they thought that the disease, if you contracted it, caused flu-like symptoms in some people. It was definitely more dangerous for people who had autoimmune issues or pregnant women. But for a while, they thought, it would cause flu-like symptoms, and then it would be in these cysts in your brain and be in a latent phase, and then it never really recurred or bothered people. But when they've investigated it more, they found that it can actually really mess with your brain, and it causes animals and people to take more risks. So strangely, things like people have more car accidents if they have toxoplasmosis. More women in Europe who had toxoplasmosis were twice as likely to commit suicide as women who didn't. So there's definitely a lot more going on there. And I think scientists are starting to uncover more and more about toxoplasmosis. And I hope that all of us bird advocates will talk about it more, because it's another reason that it's a really good idea to keep our cats inside for their own health. They live like 10 years longer than outdoor cats, and to prevent diseases and to help our birds. So
Yes.
another argument in your toolkit for keeping cats indoors.
Absolutely. Ironically, I talk about toxoplasmosis a lot. And
Good.
yes, I do. I was talking to a friend about it the other day, and I was telling her how on the west coast of California, people were flushing their cat litter down the toilet, which is something you should never do. And all of the local sea otter populations got a toxoplasmosis and just got obliterated. So, and then
I hadn't heard that.
yeah, she works for a pharmacy company, and they're working on making a vaccine for toxoplasmosis.
Wow.
And then we had the conversation, should it be for the cats, or the vaccine is going to be for the humans, but wouldn't it be for a cat? So anyway, just, yes. So make sure you're not flushing especially in Florida, don't flush your cat's waste down the toilet, and make sure it gets disposed properly. So
thanks. Thanks for that, because I hadn't heard that one. That's an amazing story. And it affects a wide range of animals, from wolves to whales. I mean, it's crazy. I just couldn't even believe it when I kept hearing about these Hawaiian monk seals dying. But it
Right.
is,
Yes.
it's a really prevalent problem. So.
Yes. Yeah.
And in Hawaii, there's a lot of feral cat colonies, and people feed feral cat colonies. And so, because of runoff, the
Yeah.
toxoplasmosis get washed into the waterways. So it's a severe problem, but a good one for us to know about.
Yes. Yes. I'm glad you brought it to our attention, as well as the lead ammunition. Another wonderful presentation. Janine was wondering, can you give us the name that we might recognize for the neon? That's a hard word.
Neonicotinoids?
Yeah, that is there
Yeah.
like a generic name? Like if we were in the store and we wanted to make sure we were buying, safe pesticides.
That's a great question, and
Okay.
I'm so grateful to have you think about looking at the ingredients of what you're buying. Um, there are so many neonicotinoids. There's hundreds of them, but some of the worst ones are imidacloprid is a really bad one. Clothianidin is another one. Thiamethoxam is one. But I think the best thing to do is just bring your phone in, and when you're getting something, just Google the ingredients. That's what I do now. A lot of these things I've also learned the hard way. Like I planted grass seed, just have a little space because of fire around my house. It's just tiny little lawn, and I planted grass seed and it was dyed blue. And I was like, well, that's good. I'll be able to see where it is and if it's blown away, or I was not upset that the seed was dyed blue. But then later, when I looked at the bag more closely, I realized it was dyed blue because it was coated with neonicotinoids. And I had been so, adamant that I wasn't going to use pesticides on my place. And because I didn't do my work up front, I ended up putting grass seed that was dyed blue. So, if you're looking at grass seed that's dyed blue, that's a good hint that probably it's coated with neonicotinoids before you plant it. But after that event, I just would bring my phone and try to look at things and try to find things that weren't coated with any
Yeah.
products. And aside from checking those kind of products like grass seed, it can help to ask your landscape people, like if you go to a nursery to buy plants, some of them are coated with neonicotinoids. So in the early days, I was trying to make pollinator gardens, and then I realized that back in a while ago, Lowe's and Home Depot and a bunch of the big nurseries would sell plants that were raised from seeds that were coated with neonicotinoids. So here you're trying to help pollinators and you're actually killing them. So, it helps to ask your landscape people or nurseries where you get your plants if they use neonicotinoids. So a lot of these places are becoming more aware of it, but I think it helps when we ask those questions, because then it makes them sort of say, oh, maybe people don't want this. So
Yes, good point. That's a great point. Right. It brings that awareness to them.
exactly.
Yes. Oh, Jeanette was wondering, and I wrote this down too. Do you happen to know who the author is of Cat Wars? If not, we can Google it. But
Peter Mara, and there's a second author that I'm drawing a blank on right now.
okay, that's
I read
okay.
it a long time ago, but it's a fabulous book.
Okay,
They
thank
did a
you.
brilliant job with it. It really is
Yes.
a tremendous book.
Yeah.
I learned so much from it.
Oh, it sounds amazing. Yes.
Yeah.
Holly was wondering what inspired you to study birds.
It's funny. I came to the bird world late. I didn't discover birds or wildlife until after college. I wish I had been one of these people who grew up with it, but I was sort of oblivious, and I did totally different things in college. I had no idea that wildlife biologists even existed. And I ended up, I was working in Washington, D.C., and thinking I maybe was going to be a diplomat because I like traveling and languages. And I loved animals, but I didn't know what you could do with it except for being a vet. And I didn't want to be a vet. But I came across a catalog for a group called the School for Field Studies that offers study abroad programs in environmental fields. And I opened this catalog up, and they had this course called Wildlife Biology in Africa. And I was reading the description, and I was like, this is what I want to be doing. Oh my God, I can't believe you could work with animals. And so I took that course. And and still wasn't into birds, which kills me. But really, it was that first summer working with peregrines. As a fluke, I just saw this job advertised and I took this job. And then sitting and watching those peregrines for the whole summer and watching them fly and being surrounded by other birds, I just fell in love with them. So the more I learned about birds, the more I wanted to work with them. And my passion originally was sort of small cats, but I realized that the thing I loved about birds is their whole life was on display. And I thought, a lot of the mammals that if you want to study mammals, you might be able to track them once, but then you'll be tracking them. They're nocturnal. You almost never see them. Like a lot of the animals that people study, you don't get to see half the time. But with birds, I just loved it because every element of their life is on display. You can see them fighting over territories and raising their young. And I just love watching behavior. So the peregrines really did it for me. And after that, there was just no looking back.
That is amazing. That is a wonderful, like, coming into your field story. I think that's like the best one I've ever heard. And I love your reason. That's really neat. I really, you just bring so much passion, and that just comes through in your presentation, in your book. I know with your book, you wanted to kind of give people more of an appreciation for birds. And I think you completely went beyond that and just kind of showed people, your admiration for them and passed it on to us. And it was if you haven't read it, go read it, go get it. It's her scientific, information, but in a very relatable and engaging way. And I mean, that's the best thing I think a scientist can do, is be able to communicate everything you've done in the field to us, and have it just read like an incredible novel almost. So thank you for spending the evening with us. I'm going to pass it back over to Scott in case he has any closing announcements. And thank you for your time and everything you've done. We're so thankful.
Thank you. I'll just say one quick thing. I presented a lot of sort of the science and the threats and the bird issues, but I really wanted to convey that stuff in a way that was, that it's heavy stuff. So I wanted to be able to tell stories about the birds, and you get to know the different birds' personalities and the different individuals. And a lot of people are really fascinated about what biology work is like, what it's like to be out there with the birds day to day, and to really just get attached to these amazing birds that you work with. So it's a lot of storytelling and adventures. It's not all a boring science slog. I think it's a lot easier to digest natural history information when it's mixed up with stories. So there's a lot of that for those of you who are interested in just reading about animals doing cool things.
And Sophie, that's what I loved about your book. I felt like I was out there with you, having the adventures that you were having, and that's what I loved about it. And like your passion, like you fell in love with birds, we fell in love with your book and your presentation today.
Well, thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us, and I hope everyone has a chance to read Sophie Osborn's book, Feather Trails. You won't be disappointed.
Thank you very much.
So I'm going to share my screen real quickly, and thank you, Hillary, for doing such a great job. Also, really appreciate it. Your enthusiasm is also contagious.
You're welcome. My pleasure. Thanks, Scott.
So thank you for joining to our great team that helped bring you these virtual presentations. Again, it takes a village, and we can't wait to see you on December 3rd as Dr. Vanya Rower, the curator of the Avian Natural History Collection at Cornell's Ornithological Lab, takes all of us with him on a virtual journey through the amazing avian specimen collection at the lab. You won't be disappointed by next month's presentation, I promise you. It's going to be really exciting to walk through the lab with Vanya, and his enthusiasm, as I said, is contagious. See you in December. Have a great Thanksgiving. I hope you get to spend some time with family, and get out there and bird, and see you soon. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Happy Thanksgiving.